to our continued discussion of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's book, Discipleship, or Cost of Discipleship. Hope that everyone had a good Easter as we continue in our celebration of the Easter season. And of course, we started this book in Lent, but we'll continue of course, as you can probably tell, the lessons and that it has for us are our travel throughout our Christian life, and would be a good discussion, especially in this day and time. So we continue in book Discipleship by Bonhoeffer. We'll finish up, as I mentioned earlier, we'll finish up the second chapter tonight and get into the third chapter as we continue our discussion. But before we jump into any new discussion, I was wondering if there are any comments or questions that might have lingered from a week ago. Um, any thoughts that might have come up just about Bonhoeffer in general, or the book in particular? All right. Well, we will go ahead and jump into our discussion. You may recall during that Monday in Holy Week, we were um, had kind of begun to talk about Bonhoeffer's discussion um, in Luke chapter 9, verses 57 through 62. So you have these three people that are called, and then Bonhoeffer kind of goes through sequentially discussing, what each person's response, and then a little bit about why that is. And again, Bonhoeffer, his understanding, his whole premise is that we are called to follow Christ, and that call comes from Christ himself, and that supersedes everything. Um, Everything that we have done, everything that we're currently doing, all of those things, when we perceive the call of Jesus, because again, we had a brief discussion last time about, is everyone called? And yes, everyone is called, because we're all called to follow Jesus as disciples. So we're all called. So it's when we perceive and discern that call, it is to follow. And it's not into a particular uh, profession or anything else, but just simply to follow Jesus, just simply to be close to Jesus, be in right relationship with Jesus, hear what Jesus needs for us to do, and then to do it. And so, and I think it's kind of served the church to talk about call in this very particular way, that sets certain people apart from, the regular Christian. But Bonhoeffer is saying, and I think we're coming to a greater understanding in the church, that this really is about, Jesus came for us all. We're all called to be disciples. We're all called into relationship with Jesus. And that will look different for us depending on what God needs, what Jesus needs, but we're all called. And so, yes, so ordained people, yes, called, have a specific role to play within the community, but all of us are called. And we're all called to serve as God needs for us to serve. And so we're all called to follow Jesus and then to obey him. So, just, kind of quickly, the first disciple wanted to follow Jesus. That's, I'll follow you wherever you go, this particular person says. And then Jesus says, well, there is a cost. Foxes of the earth have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. So when you answer the call to Jesus, it's not going to be set up thus and so. You're not going to necessarily have a clear blueprint, a clear, trajectory or pathway. You're going to be following on this really great and grand adventure. To what will God have you to do? Where will you end up going to serve and to follow Jesus? All of these things. So it's not a settled thing. As this particular person is saying, "Oh, I'll do anything. I'll follow you wherever you go." Well, do you understand what that means? Jesus is trying to set out the cost. He's not trying to trick anyone, but he wants people to know that when they follow, that the pathway isn't always clear. But again, as Bonhoeffer was saying, and I think this rings true, that our ultimate success or happiness or satisfaction is just simply being with Jesus. And when we're with Jesus, then we have the proximity to hear what he says and to do what he does, tells us to do, or to emulate and imitate what he's doing. Therefore, God is served, and the whole world is now knows more about the truth of God and Jesus Christ. So the second disciple wants to go bury his father before he follows Jesus. Begin Bonhoeffer is saying that nothing should come in the way of following Jesus. Nothing, as he says at the bottom of 20 on to the top of 21, under no circumstances anything permitted to come between Jesus and the one called, even that which is greatest in holiness, even the law. So now this, again, this is Jesus talking. This isn't a prophet. This isn't a religious person. This isn't a leader of the synagogue. This is God, the Son of God, speaking, and can speak beyond the law. Can say, you know, what supersedes all of these things is my word. And when I call, the expectation is that we will answer and go, or when the instructions come, that we will obey, as Bonhoeffer talks about in the next chapter. Simple obedience. But so, and then in the third way, well, before we get to the third, uh, the understanding too that Bonhoeffer is saying is that, when we look at the biblical calls in general, particularly Jesus, it's almost that there is an irresistibility to his call. When Peter and Andrew, James, and John are called, they get up immediately. When Matthew is pushed in the tax booth, he gets up and leaves immediately. This understanding that the call is in some ways irresistible. I mean, obviously we have free will, we can reject it, we can go another direction. We've seen that in other ways in the scriptures, particularly Jonah and some others. But but there is an irresistibility, or maybe more accurately, a persistence to God's call, uh, persistence to the call of Jesus. The St. Andrew's hymn is called, Jesus calls us o'er the tumult of life's long restless sea. Day by day, his clear voice call us, saying, Christian, follow me. Day by day, even moment by moment, even breath by breath, we can perceive, or we know and trust that God is calling us. I can hear the Savior calling. I can hear the Savior calling. I can hear the Savior calling, saying, Christian, Christian, follow me. Where he leads me, I will follow, as the hymn says. So there's this insistence, incessant, and always and ever alluring call of Jesus. Yes, we can block it out. Yes, we can ignore it, but it's ever present, always there. And so we have many, many, many opportunities to answer. Um, can we miss opportunities? Of course. Is there a point of no return? Of course, there is, but that nonetheless, God continues to call us, continues to beckon us, continues to invite us into this deeper relationship of getting closer with Jesus, so that Jesus really does become our all in all. Um, and then the third, like the first, you know, really understands, this call and wants to follow, but his fatal flaw, as it were, is let me first. Um, he wants to follow, but he wants to put, his own conditions on it. Discipleship is a possibility for him, Bonhoeffer says, whose implementation requires fulfilling conditions and prerequisites. This makes discipleship something humanly reasonable and comprehensible. The disciple makes himself available, but retains the right to set his own conditions. It is obvious that at that moment, discipleship stops being discipleship. It becomes a human program, which I can organize according to my own judgment and can justify rationally and ethically. So, we probably all have been in situations where we're not quite ready. And I'm not talking about the call of Jesus. I'm just talking about in general, because it doesn't make sense. Maybe there's an opportunity somewhere, it's a good opportunity and we want to go, but it doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit. There are too many variables. We've all probably been in situations where, we didn't have enough data to make the decision, so we didn't move forward. Sometimes that proved to be prudent, because there were some things that we couldn't have foreseen that took place or weren't in place, that we might have assumed were, and because we didn't move forward, we were saved the embarrassment or the struggle or the failure of the thing. Um, so we understand that. We understand, looking at things logically, and we don't want to act impulsively. We've been taught, and we've also seen the folly and the danger of impulsively doing anything. So we don't want to do that. But Bonhoeffer is saying that in a lot of ways, there is impulsivity to following Christ. Now, it's not that Christ doesn't know. Christ as God, knows everything that's going to happen, but we don't. Um, and the challenge is that we are developing a certain level of trust, that we claim to have. We pray in the Lord's prayers and said before, give us this day our daily bread, not bread enough to keep us fed, until kingdom come, but daily, relying on God each and every day to provide what's necessary. Now, that provision comes in different ways, but yet and still there's a sense that we are moving along day to day, based on what God's will is and God's way is. So there's this kind of impulsivity a following following the call. Again, it doesn't make logical sense a lot of times, but there is a sense in it, not simply, of peace, clearly, but also a sense that, okay, this is the right thing to do. I don't have all of the I's dotted and all the T's crossed, but I'm trusting God enough that it will be okay, that I will have what I need, that the right people will show up to offer assistance, that I'll get good, wise, and godly counsel as I go along. But first, it's realizing that we can trust God enough to move forward into this life that God's prepared for us. Um, and ultimately, it's a conforming or giving up, as it were, of our will, subverting our will, God's will. And that's obviously much easier said than done. But again, for Bonhoeffer, and I think, this rings true in the Gospels, that the expectation is that we trust the one who invites us enough. So we trust Jesus enough to pay attention to the fact that God provides, that God will never leave us forsaken, that God gives us what we need when we need it. And so this understanding of the truth of the gospel then kind of translates into, okay, now I can trust God. I can't see more than a couple steps in front of me, but I trust that God's leading me. Um, okay, so I'll pause there for a minute, see if there are any questions, comments. Okay. So I want to make sure this might take us a little time because it's somewhat confusing, or it might be. This next part, where Bonhoeffer is kind of justifying or at least trying to make a case for kind of what comes first, the chicken and the egg, the obedience or the faith. Um, how does it work out that obedience and faith work together? Um, because some would say, well, I believe, I have faith, therefore I'm obedient. And others might say, I'm obedient, and that is evidence of my faith. And so Bonhoeffer works this out as kind of like the conundrum that James answers in his letter. Is it faith or is it works? Well, if you tell me you have faith, but you don't do anything with it, then what good is your faith? James says, paraphrasing. But if I will show you my faith, James says, by the works that I do. So it's a both and, but for Bonhoeffer and dealing with this ultimate and complete obedience to Jesus and to the call, there's a question of, okay, do I believe first and then obey, or do I obey first and then believe? And spoiler alert, as you've probably already read, it's the obedience comes first. And it might seem counterintuitive, but it really is the fact that we obey, and that obedience, is has to be based on the faith, on what we believe. Um, and then, and in many ways, it's a very Anglican way to look at things, because as we no doubt know and understand from the tradition that we follow, that there is a sense in the tradition, because of the repetition or the repetitiveness of the cycle of the church, of the readings that are in the lectionary, that there is a work that continues to happen. And so, it's that, faith shapes believing, this understanding of the repetitiveness of the daily office, for instance, where we're praying similar prayers, every day. That shapes our belief. So we trust, that in the tradition that's been handed to us, that there is that of God. And we trust that as we hear these prayers over and over again, year in and year out, decade in, decade out, that they form us. And so our belief becomes fuller. We try to grow into our belief by doing these things day in and day out. And we've all experienced that to some extent, what our parents and grandparents and godparents and and family members, aunts and uncles taught us about the church, or what we learned about the church that we continue to practice, really becomes a part of us. Now the trick is not just simply doing it by rote, not just simply doing it because we were told to, but that that practice begins to form us, not just simply to do the practice more, but begins to deepen our faith in the God that we're praying to, in the God that we're reading about, in the God that we're singing and chanting about. So there's this process piece that happens, and for Bonhoeffer, it is really, obedience. It's not knowing everything and figuring everything out that leads to grows and matures our faith. Um, that it's really hearing the call and following that then forms the faith that we have, or out of which that obedience grows. And but again, for Bonhoeffer, the obedience is key. So let me see, just to pick out some of
Um,
the particular things that he says. Um,
mm,
so, the first step puts the follower into a situation of being able to believe. Um, so, so this idea that we are obedient to God, obedient to the call of Christ, um, is of vital importance because the road to faith passes through obedience to Christ's call. That's you know just beyond the upper half of page 23. That the road to faith passes through obedience to Christ's call. The step is required, otherwise Jesus' call dissipates into nothing. Bonhoeffer says. Any intended discipleship without this step, that is this obedience, which Jesus calls, this step to which Jesus calls, becomes deceptive enthusiasts' illusion. So if our action is not based on obedience, then it really is not connected to God. He has said before, and he'll say again, we can do all of these things that are right, that are good. But if we're not doing them because Jesus commanded us to, we're not doing it because we're doing it because we're obeying what Jesus has said, then they still ring hollow. Similar to Paul, in 1 Corinthians 13, I speak with tongues of angels and men, but I have not love, a clanging gong and a crashing cymbal. This idea that we can do all of these wonderful things, but if it's not based on obedience to Christ, then Paul, coming alongside that, or coming before that, saying based on love, then it's really not worth it. It's not worth what we think it is. It might look nice and sound nice, and it might even be nice, but if it's not coming out of a command from God to us, if we're not following Jesus's call to follow, then we're, not stating it too strongly, but we're outside of God's will because we're doing all of these things based on God's will, based on obedience to what Christ has called us into. And so that is our foremost motivation. It's not to, be a nice person. It's not to be an obedient person to the things that people have taught us. It's subtle but profound that our internal moorings for doing the things that we do are connected with being obedient to the call of Christ in our life. Not obedience to the people that taught us way back when, not obedience to appearing to be, have a certain piety in the face of others, not obedience to anything else but obedience to Christ. And if we find ourselves substituting something else, then we're really, even though we're doing good things, we're still outside of the will of God. So that's why we have to be very careful, very discerning, very reflective about why we are doing what we are doing. Because the utmost, again, is to follow God's call, to follow and be obedient to what God would have us to do. And so we have to check in with ourselves regularly. Hey, why am I doing this? What is my utmost desire when I pray, when I go and serve in the church in whatever capacity, when I serve in the world in whatever capacity, when I sing, when I study, all of these things. What is my motivation for that? And Bonhoeffer would say, and I think Oswald says, is obedience to Christ. Yes, Missy.
Yes, I was, giving this a lot of thought.
Mhm.
And when Bonhoeffer spoke about cheap grace and costly grace,
Mhm.
I compare it to like when we say, we're called to do this or do that in the church. And Bonhoeffer is talking about discipleship. And I think there's a difference there between called, you said we're all called, but then Bonhoeffer is saying discipleship is when you have to be prepared to give up your prior life, make sacrifice. serious sacrifices to follow Christ and do the things that Christ are asking for. Like when Jesus told the man to sell all his possessions and follow him. So that's the ultimate thing. And that's the difference between being called and discipleship. Yes, we're being called to do work in church, but then called to do discipleship work is making the ultimate sacrifice. Yes. Mm-hmm. That's my little take on that. I don't know if you can expand on it more. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think someone had a response. Yes.
Is
Yes.
he non-traditionist?
Is Bonhoeffer?
Yeah. It's coming over that way to me because tradition is important up to a point.
Right. Yeah.
But
yeah.
he's requesting removal of traditions.
Right.
Ways.
To a certain extent, yeah. To a certain extent, I mean, he's really challenging what the current state of the church is,
Right.
and what he like Luther is trying to get beyond what the tradition has set up as, as the goal and the benchmark for discipleship and for following Jesus. That those things aren't it. They might be good, they might be holy, but they're not uh, essentially what Jesus is asking. And so, to the extent that those whatever, like you said, we'll call tradition, writ large. If that gets in the way of following Jesus, or if people think that adhering to that is the utmost call, Bonhoeffer is saying that's not. And the reason that he's saying it's not because we see how that could be co-opted. And so, I mean, it's very similar to what Jesus says to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. You follow all these laws and all this structure very well. You're very righteous. You're the most righteous in the community, he says. And he says to others, if you're not going to be righteous like them, then you're not fit. But their focus was on the checking off of the boxes of following tradition and not the love of God, because then that caused them to miss a lot of the finer points of what God was trying to say. So, yeah, so I think, I mean, I think he's really pushing those that are reading and pushing the church in Germany at the time to examine what it is, what their motivation is. And for him, he's seeing that it's this motivation to this cheap grace or this tradition that isn't really serving the gospel, especially when it's so easily co-opted by the state. Yeah.
Thank you.
And to go back, thank you, Ms. Curtis. And thank you, Ms. Caesar. And actually, chapter 3 talks a lot about what you said. And so we'll get to that in just a minute. We'll elaborate on your points in just a minute, because that's pretty much the entirety of chapter 3, that question, or those points that you placed. So we'll come to that in just a minute. Um, uh, so let me.
Can you believe without having faith?
You know, well, then the question would be, what are you believing in if you don't have faith?
You accept whatever there is.
But in order to have, to believe, or you're believing in something. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of similar. So Bonhoeffer, I guess it's in the middle of 24. He said, obedience remains separated from faith. Because we are justified by faith, faith and obedience have to be distinguished. But their division must never destroy their unity, which lies in the reality that faith exists only in obedience and never without obedience. Faith is only faith in deeds of obedience. So if you replace in your question, Ms. Gaskin, if you replace faith, a belief with obedience, which could do, you'd be a little bit of a stretch, but just for the sake of argument right now, then the Bonhoeffer would say that you really can't have one without the other. But that faith depends on obedience. So faith is only faith in deeds of obedience. So again, it's kind of that classical works is dead. There has to be a two part piece to how we live out our belief in the world. And it takes both, but Bonhoeffer is saying that the obedience comes first. That you can't say I have faith, you can't say I believe without being obedient. And so again, for Bonhoeffer, his contention, is that believers or faithful people are obedient. And you can't say that I believe.
Faith is first, and then with faith, you believe.
No, Bonhoeffer is saying, and I tend to agree that obedience is first. That obedience to Jesus's call is first, and that out of that obedience, your faith becomes evident. Yeah, right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And out of that comes the belief.
Yes. Because then you have then you have an object, for lack of a better term, that you're believing in.
Action.
Mm-hmm.
Which is faith, is the action.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay. So, and to your point, here on the end of the last full paragraph on 24, in the same way that obedience is called a consequence of faith, it is also called a prerequisite of faith. So again, for Bonhoeffer, this obedience piece is key. You don't get anywhere without first being obedient. And you're obedient to the call that Jesus has, the call that is in many ways universal in what we know of Jesus, but there is a particularity to each of our calls that this is a piece of our ongoing discernment about what it looks like in the world, to be obedient to God as a particular individual, but then of course as members of wider communities, of church communities, of denominations, of what wider and larger associations. Um, so if those that have the book, if you flip over to page 26, the other thing Bonhoeffer says here in the middle of that page, or just above the page, is if we take the first step with the intention of putting ourselves into the situation of being able to believe, then even this ability to believe is itself nothing but works. It is but a new possibility for living within our old existence, and thereby a complete misunderstanding. So Bonhoeffer really is saying that anything without obedience is more of an exercise of our own will. That everything that we do has to be based on following God's call, God's commandment, being obedient to what God needs. Because the minute we get away from that obedience, then we're doing our own thing. and our own thing is quickly and easily corrupted. Again, this is all in the context of the church being co-opted by the state in Nazi Germany. So, so if anything that we do is not based on our desire uh, or our goal of being obedient to God through Jesus, then then it's a purely human experiment, a purely human endeavor, and that's again for Bonhoeffer, and I think for Jesus as well, is what the gospel is trying to guard against us acting, even, and Bonhoeffer would say this, and to a certain extent, Paul would, Jesus does, that, that when we do things just based on our own understanding, then it's easily corrupted. And we see this in the church. We see it through the history of Christianity, well, in the history of religion in general. We see it, in contemporary when things get off, and more homage, more intention, more emphasis is placed on a certain particularity of an understanding, but that's not tied to what Jesus told us to do, not tied to the call that Jesus has on us all. And to a certain extent, we won't push this too hard a place or state it too strongly, but that also happens for us individually. When we're doing things, and again, they're good things, holy things, beautiful things, but when we're doing them outside of being obedient to God, being obedient to the call of Christ in our life, that's when I think that's often when it comes back to us, like, okay, wait a minute, I'm doing all these good things. I'm doing all the right things. I'm checking all the boxes. I'm praying and going to church and, doing all of the things that we've, most all of us have been taught to do, and it's still not working out. Why is it not working out? Well, on some level, it's because we're not doing it with the right intention, or we're not doing it because we're doing it to obey God. We're doing it to obey something else, our image of ourselves, the image that we've been taught about, whatever the case is. But when we're doing it for the sake of Christ and for obedience to God's call, then this is not that everything becomes perfect and everything works out beautifully, but we're more satisfied in that, because our goal is to be with Jesus. And the prerequisite of being with Jesus is obeying Jesus, is following Jesus, is being in close proximity to Jesus. And so that becomes, its own reward ultimately. And that's really what heaven is. Is being in God's presence, being near and growing into the love that God has for us, that is limitless and we'll never exhaust it. That is our motivation, to be close to that kind of love. And the way for Bonhoeffer, but also the way, that Jesus shows is that when the call comes, or when we perceive it, or when we understand that that our desire is to be with Jesus, then we follow and we obey. And that obedience brings us and keeps us in a closer orbit with our Savior. Similar to, the reading that we're going to have Sunday, the road to Emmaus. Were not our hearts burning within us as he opened the scriptures to us, as he broke bread? There's this kind of fulfillment that is only lasting and deep and truly satisfying when we're in God's presence, when we're close to Jesus. And it's something that we can't that we can't duplicate anywhere else. And so that becomes its own motivation, because that feeling of being with Jesus that helps us to navigate, all of the stuff that doesn't work, all of the things that come against us, and the mistreatment that we often endure, the misunderstandings. All of those things are kept in proper perspective, in that as long as we have Jesus, as the spiritual says, one of my favorites, you can have the whole world, give me Jesus, give me Jesus, give me Jesus. You can have the whole world, but give me Jesus. And when we have Jesus, all is well. It's not perfect. It's not without disappointment, but it's well because the peace of Christ is with us. And that's essentially what Bonhoeffer is trying to encourage the people that are reading this in his day and time, the folks that were at his seminary, but also is trying to encourage us in this day and time to not give any of that away, to not give up on that fullness of the experience of God that satisfies us so much so that everything else has its proper place in our mind, in our heart, and in how we see the world. And it's all, filtered through this profound experience of Jesus. And again, for Bonhoeffer, it's by obedience that we come into that. It's by, desperately wanting to be close to Jesus at all times, that we really experience that kind of fullness and satisfaction. Let me see. I think, he spends a lot of time in these next, again, talking about obedience and faithfulness and that. I think we've gotten the basics of that. Okay. So what I do want to do is look at the beginning of chapter 3. Because here he tries to distill it anymore, and this will take a little while to work through because it's not as straightforward as it maybe could be. And we can work at distilling it a little bit more. But Bonhoeffer in this very short chapter 3, talks about simple obedience. And so on that first page he says, you know, that entrusting themselves, these are those that just got up and followed Jesus when he called, entrusting themselves to the word of Jesus Christ, believing it to be a stronger foundation than all the securities of the world. Again, this is Bonhoeffer reiterating the fact that service to Jesus, obedience to Jesus is overall, it supersedes everything. And so, then on the next couple of pages, he talks about, Jesus's discussion going back to the rich young ruler and says, sell his possessions. And so he spends, these first couple of pages kind of juxtaposing what Jesus says and how the church and the world kind of explain that away, rationalize it away. Well, what Jesus really means, he doesn't really mean sell all your possessions. He means that, you can have possessions, but you shouldn't be owned by your possessions. And you can live as if you didn't have them and, let them overtake you and all that. But he's saying, well, which one is it? Is it, what Jesus says, sell all your possessions, or is it this kind of rationalization that allows you to keep hold to those things that you already have while still purporting to follow Jesus? And again, for Bonhoeffer in his day and age, this is exactly what he saw the church do. And this is the definition of the cheap grace, that you really don't have to do anything different. You really don't have to obey what Jesus says. You can do something else. You can hold on to that. You can keep doing the things that you were doing, but then also claim the lordship of Jesus and following Jesus. And Bonhoeffer was saying you can't do that. You can't, it's not a both and. But then, interestingly enough, he spends all of this time again in the first couple of pages of chapter 3, juxtaposing, cheap grace and costly grace, this justification, this kind of explaining away of kind of a very literal understanding of what Jesus is saying. This kind of nuanced version. He ultimately comes around to saying that the obedience to Jesus is about Jesus. It's not about us giving up anything. It's not about us doing anything. It's about us obeying Jesus, following Jesus. So then on page 47, he says, the step into the situation is not something people offer Jesus. It is always Jesus's gracious offer to people. So again, it's a very fine point, and it's kind of convoluted, but essentially Bonhoeffer is saying that again, everything is about Jesus. It's about Jesus's action. It's not so much about ours, but it's about Jesus moving toward us, and then us accepting that grace, and then and then being obedient to what accepting that grace means. So it's not so much about us doing anything except saying yes. Um, and then everything that follows after that is based on what Jesus commands us. Everything that follows after that, after we have said yes, after we get up and follow, is then based on what Jesus says. So Jesus says, okay, this is what I need you to do. Then the understanding is that we do that. And it's not necessarily the same for everybody. And that's the thing, again, that the Bonhoeffer is trying to get us to understand is that what we do is solely and strictly based on obedience to what Jesus is calling us to do. Jesus is calling all of us to follow, but the particularities, the individual actions that come out of that are very specific to what Jesus is asking us as individuals to do. And that takes a lot of discernment. That takes a lot of testing. Okay, I know I want to follow Jesus. I know I want to be obedient to Jesus' command. I know that I want to be close to Jesus and be satisfied by Jesus's presence, just simply being around him. And I know all of that. And so now that I'm following, what does that look like on the ground? What does it look like when Jesus says turn the other cheek? What does that mean in my situation? What does it look like when Jesus says, give away everything that you have and follow me? What does that mean in my situation? Because I think where we get stuck a lot of times is that we're not listening to what Jesus would have us to do. And so the powers that be swoop in when it's convenient and say, okay, if you're going to follow Jesus and be obedient to Jesus, this is what you must do. And everybody has this same is given this kind of same understanding, when that's not necessarily the case. There are broad strokes that we understand as the call of Jesus and what Jesus expects of people that are obedient to God, but it does look different. And depending on the context, depending on where you are, depending on what you have, individually, inherently, but also what you have gained throughout your life. There are just different expectations for that, but the common denominator is obeying Jesus. And sometimes we get stuck looking at other people that we think for ourselves, whether we're following what Jesus is telling us to do or not, where we say, okay, they should be doing that. And if they're not doing that, they're not being a good Christian or they're not following. But we really don't necessarily know that. I mean, we can obviously, people that are out here, killing and exploiting people, I mean, they try to say, that that's God told them to. Well, we know that's patently false and dismiss that out of hand. But but by the same token, if if we're all trying to do the good, the right, the holy thing, but what I'm doing in accordance to my understanding of what Jesus is calling me to do looks different than yours, and vice versa, we ought not be at odds about that. Um, excuse me, again, because we don't know everything about everything that everyone's doing, it's probably not, doesn't serve us well. It takes a lot of our energy and focus away from what God is actually calling us to do. But if it looks different for one person than it does for me, uh, that is okay. Because as long as we are being obedient to what Jesus is telling us to do, how it looks might be different. And so, but we have to, again, have to focus on what God is calling us to do and focus and trust in God's leading through Jesus, that we are doing what it is that we are commanded to do. And that keeps us in that relationship, keeps us in that close proximity, keeps us following Jesus's every move, every footstep, so that we are really satisfied by that which is most important to us, and that's being with Jesus. And I said it before, and I'll probably say it again a few times during this conversation, on Bonhoeffer. It's very much like what Augustine says, our hearts are made for you and we're restless until we return. We're made to be in a relationship with God. And so we're only fully satisfied when we're in close proximity to God, when we're basking in the love of God, when we're following where God leads, when we're in the near presence of Jesus. And so if that is our soul's desire, then we're compelled to obey. And it's not, kind of a draconian, you must do, lording it over us kind of obedience. It's I really want to I want to please want this person, this Jesus, to look at me, and say, "Well done." I want to gladden God's heart, as it were, and just simply being in God's presence is the highest order, the greatest thing that I can possibly imagine. And so, in order to do that, I'm going to be obedient, and the obedience is to follow. And so, I'm going to stay in Christ's presence, so that not only can I feel fulfilled, but also so that I know that I'm in the midst of God's will for my life, and ultimately am participating in the salvation and reconciliation of the world. Good. So at the end of chapter 3, and we can come back if folks want to dig into this any deeper next week, but at the end of chapter 3, the last part of the last sentence, or the last sentence, being saved by discipleship is not a human possibility, but for God, all things are possible. So it's our action is to follow, to be obedient, and then all of it is about God and God's plan and God's will and God's way. All right. So thank you all very much. I know we kind of rushed through chapter 3. We could take a little bit of time, but I definitely wanted to get to that piece of chapter 3. We can recap a little bit of chapter 3 next week, but we'll spend the majority of our time in chapter 4. Chapter 4 is a little longer. It's discipleship and the cross, where he kind of really digs into Christ's passion and puts that against, as an example for us who would follow Christ. So thank you all. I know Complin's going to start in about a minute. So we look forward to being together next week. If you have questions or comments, concerns, something that we didn't get to, jot it down, and we'll deal with it next week. But thank you all for your time and attention. As always, your contributions help to enrich our conversation, and the wrestling with the questions are very good. So thank you all. Have a good night, and we will move to Compliment. Blessings to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome.